7 choir girls vanished after the final hymn echoed through St. Bartholomew's Cathedral. Decades later, a single letter surfaced, written in one of their hands. The last thing anyone in St. Bartholomew Square heard that night was an off-key soprano, thin and trembling, swallowed by the cathedral's stone ribs. The choir loft emptied in silence, robes folded, hymn books left open, candles guttering like tired moons. By dawn, 7 chairs were empty and 7 voices gone. The city locked its doors and whispered questions. Then, in 2024, a forgotten parcel surfaced inside it. A page of handwriting that belonged to one of the missing girls. And with it, a secret that had waited half a century to be read. Missing shadows, every shadow has a story. Subscribe. Detective Clara Reed had a way of listening that made people say things they hadn't meant to. She'd grown up on rainy streets outside Manchester, a child who watched church bells swing and wondered who kept time when they stopped. Now, in her early 40s, with a silver streak through her brown hair and a scar from a childhood bike fall near her eyebrow, she carried a quiet steadiness coffee in a blue thermos, a worn paperback of Eliot tucked in her locker. She liked small facts, the smell of old paper, the way light hit a tiled floor at noon. It made her feel anchored. Across town, Michael Hale still kept a choir robe folded in the back of his wardrobe, the cotton smelling faintly of incense and mothballs. He'd been 19 when the girls vanished, one of St. Bartholomew's lay clerks. Then, Michael was 48 now, his face leaner, his hands rougher from years as a luthier who repaired church organs. He had a photograph of 7 laughing girls tucked in a drawer. Sometimes he'd take it out at night and trace a thumb over the edges until the paper warmed. There was also June Albright, who'd been a teenager when she sang soprano in 1991 and is now editor of the local paper. June had a dog-eared journal of poetry and the habit of humming the same hymn when she was anxious or tiny. Human tick that betrayed how close this case always sat to her bones. These 3 carried different griefs and comforts. Clara wanted answers like a surgeon wants steady hands. Michael wanted to know if the girls had been frightened. June wanted to give names back the dignity of closure. When the letter arrived, handwritten hymns on brittle paper, their worlds tilted. A small unease settled in each of them, like a missing refrain in an old song. It was a wet March in 1991 when the cathedral bells seemed to ring too long, as if refusing to be quiet. St. Bartholomew's was a cathedral of stone and shadow, the kind that remembered names and accidents. The choir rehearsed Wednesday evenings, practice, a cup of tea, the rector's jokes, then home. That night, the girls had stayed behind for extra practice. They wanted to perfect a harmony for Sunday, a hymn their grandparents had sung. The rector, Father Ambrose, smiled and locked the vestry at 9. The organist, a former man named Mr. Whitcomb, walked home humming a bass line. No one recorded the exact last words, but neighbors remembered candles in the choir loft, the creak of the heavy door being pulled, and, most oddly, an unfamiliar van with a dented bumper parked in the lane across from the cathedral between 9:30 and 10 o'clock p.m. By morning, 7 small shoes sat in a neat arc at the base of the choir loft steps, polished, laced, lined up like evidence someone had meant to preserve. The girls' hymn books lay on pews, pens left in the margin where someone had underlined a refrain. But there were no footprints outside in the dew, no sign of a struggle, no fingerprints on the vestry door. The police conducted interviews that smelled of stale coffee and nerves. The press camped on the square. Candle vigils formed that lasted weeks. Parents aged visibly in the space of a seasoned hair whitening, eyes hollowing into the shapes of questions. Rumors rippled: a runaway, a secret elopement, a cult, a local man with a grudge. Some swore they'd seen the girls later in far towns. Others claimed to have dreams of them singing at midnight in fields. The official, Ledan, untraced, van turned cold. The rector's statements were ambiguous. He'd been evasive about an after-hours meeting he'd had at the Cathedral library with 2 visiting clergy, claiming it was about repairs. Mr. Whitcomb left abruptly 6 weeks later, his reasons stated as poor health, yet he never returned to the organ bench. The investigation slowed into a pattern of hope and disappointment. Evidence dried up like the candle wax on the vestry table. The city moved on in small ways. Cafes opened, businesses swapped names on their doors. But for those who loved the missing 7, the calendar had stopped on that damp March night. And then, silence. 33 years later, the thing nobody expected was a parcel. It turned up beneath the municipal parking lot when workers were excavating for a new foundation. They found a steel trunk, rusted but stubborn, and inside draped in oilcloth the choir's hymn books. The brittle margins had notes in a precise, looping handwriting. 7 different hands filling the margins with private lines. Doodled stars, a pressed violet between pages. Alongside the books was a bundle of letters tied with a red ribbon. The handwriting on the envelopes matched the marginalia. The girls' names: Lila, Emma, Kate, Nor, Becca, and Anne looped on the topmost letter in ink, the color of dried tea: June Albright. Now editor, received a call from a city official who knew her by her work on human interest pieces. "We found something from St. Bartholomew's," he said, voice faltering. "You should see this." She drove through rain-sheened streets, the city feeling both unfamiliar and exactly the same. When she opened the trunk, a smelled paper, faint lavender unfurled memory like a curtain. She felt her chest clench. These were the same hymns, the same doodles. Clara was assigned to the case partly because of an old file with her handwriting in the margins. She'd requested it years ago for unrelated research and never quite closed it. Reading the newly unearthed letters felt like stepping into a room the world had left locked. The girls wrote of petty teenage things: a crush on a bell ringer, a botched audition, the taste of chapel tea, and then, in one letter, a line that made Clara's stomach drop. "We promised to keep the secret about the library meeting. Promise me if anything happens. Tell father not to bury the papers." The paper was smudged as if from tears. Michael, when he heard, came to the trunk and found the photograph he'd never shown anyone tucked in one of the hymnals, folded and creased into the corner as if it had been pressed to keep someone warm. Fingerprints smudged the edge, not his. The discovery rewired the old ache into something frantic and insistent. If the letters meant anything, someone had hidden these things sententially beneath a parking lot. Not far from where the choir practiced, the past collided with the present with a force like an organ pedal striking a chord. Questions that had softened into whispering ghosts hardened. Who had packed the trunk? Why hide 7 children's voices under a municipal lot? And most urgent of all, if someone had wanted these voices silenced, who had the power to make a cathedral's secret stay buried for 3 decades? What they found under the parking lot was not just old paper. 33 years later, the thing nobody expected was a parcel. It turned up beneath the municipal parking lot when workers were excavating for a new foundation. They found a steel trunk, rusted but stubborn, and inside draped in oilcloth the choir's hymn books. The brittle margins had notes in a precise, looping handwriting. 7 different hands filling the margins with private lines. Doodled stars, a pressed violet between pages. Alongside the books was a bundle of letters tied with a red ribbon. The handwriting on the envelopes matched the marginalia. The girls' names: Lila, Emma, Kate, Nor, Becca, and Anne looped on the topmost letter in ink, the color of dry tea. June Albright, now editor, received a call from a city official who knew her by her work on human interest pieces. "We found something from St. Bartholomew's," he said, voice faltering. "You should see this." She drove through rain-sheened streets, the city feeling both unfamiliar and exactly the same. When she opened the trunk, a smelled paper, faint lavender unfurled memory like a curtain. She felt her chest clench. These were the same hymns, the same doodles. Clara was assigned to the case partly because of an old file with her handwriting in the margins. She'd requested it years ago for unrelated research and never quite closed it. Reading the newly unearthed letters felt like stepping into a room the world had left locked. The girls wrote of petty teenage things: a crush on a bell ringer, a botched audition, the taste of chapel tea, and then, in one letter, a line that made Clara's stomach drop. "We promised to keep the secret about the library meeting. Promise me if anything happens. Tell father not to bury the papers." The paper was smudged as if from tears. Michael, when he heard, came to the trunk and found the photograph he'd never shown anyone tucked in one of the hymnals, folded and creased into the corner as if it had been pressed to keep someone warm. Fingerprints smudged the edge, not his. The discovery rewired the old ache into something frantic and insistent. If the letters meant anything, someone had hidden these things sententially beneath a parking lot. Not far from where the choir practiced, the past collided with the present with a force like an organ pedal striking a chord. Questions that had softened into whispering ghosts hardened. Who had packed the trunk? Why hide 7 children's voices under a municipal lot? And most urgent of all, if someone had wanted these voices silenced, who had the power to make a cathedral's secret stay buried for 3 decades? What they found under the parking lot was not just old paper. Clara expected named suspects and tidy motives. Instead, she found alliances formed in silence. The contractor, David Kershaw, alive and thin, admitted he had been paid to dig in the cathedral yard in March of 1991. He said the rector had insisted the work be off the books and paid in cash. Kershaw's hands trembled when he described prying up a flagstone and lowering a wooden crate into a shallow cavity. He had been told to reseal it and never speak of the exact contents. He remembered the rector's face that night, pale, urgent, apologetic. He remembered a night watchman who'd arrived with 2 men in business suits. He remembered being asked not to ask questions. But the men in suits were not what the press expected. They were not sinister cult leaders or masked strangers. They were trustees, powerful donors who kept their names behind building wings and stained glass windows. They had influence. They had money. They had, apparently, the ability to steer the cathedral's decisions without explanation. One trustee, a local magnate named Edward Latham, denied everything, his voice steady and dismissive. Yet a ledger found in an old bank archive, dusty and nearly illegible, showed transfers to accounts connected to the diocese, in odd amounts that matched those donations. There were memos referencing discretion and handling delicate matters. The most gutting reveal came not from paper but from memory. Michael, combing through old photographs at home with June, found an image that had been misfiled in his drawer. A group shot of the Cathedral staff from January 1991, with a man in a dark coat half-turned, face blurred but instantly familiar. Michael's chest tightened. It was Father Ambrose, but older photos revealed a second face in the background, the rector of a neighboring parish, Canon Albright. June's throat went dry. Canon Albright was her father. June spent a night that felt wet and thin with shock, finding in her memory a scandal she'd been taught to bury. Her father had once brought visitors to the cathedral library, men who spoke in low voices about expanding influence. She had always loved him as a child, his laugh, his largesse, but now the laugh seemed to echo differently. She confronted him. He claimed ignorance, his hands trembling as if age alone had stolen his memory. He denied any knowledge of the crate of hush money, of the van that betrayal cut deeper because it wasn't a stranger who might be accused. It was a circle of people whose names were on plaques and whose faces had smiled from program leaflets. The cathedral had been, in public, a place of sanctuary. Behind closed doors, discretion had its own morality. Clara's investigation revealed that the trustees had reasons to hush scandal, something about a planned wing that would have required inconvenient scrutiny. Something about property and influence that, if exposed, would have cost reputations and bank accounts. The twist, the thing that changed the investigation from a hunt for a missing van to a fight against institutional silence, was this. The girls had stumbled onto something in the cathedral library. A diary, a ledger, a record that implicated men who could bury evidence and, if they decided, bury witnesses. They had not been taken randomly. They had been moved, and papers had been hidden, and promises had been made to keep those promises forever. But that wasn't the final truth. As Clara read the girl's marginalia again, she found a last penciled line, almost childish. If we must go, sing the hymn upside down so we can remember. It suggested something far more painful that the girls had known, in some small way, that their secret was dangerous, and had tried to leave a breadcrumb that only another child might understand. Clara pushed where power resisted. She subpoenaed bank records, coaxed witnesses who had been bought with quiet sums into speaking with the promise of anonymity, and watched as small truths unfurled. The parking lot trunk, the contractor's admission, the trustee ledgers. These threads began to weave into a rope. It led, finally, to an underground crypt beneath an old vestry extension, a place no one walked anymore because a generation had preferred the new hall. The crypt's air was thin and smelled of mineral and old ointment. It held wooden shelves, jars of ants in suspended time, and a plaster niche where someone had once placed votive candles. Clara pried at a stone that had been mortared over and found a cavity. Inside were relics, pieces of fabric, a small carved wooden toy, a single locket with a faded portrait, and a folded hymn sheet with 7 voices written across it, layered like lamplight. The hairs rose on her arms. She called in Michael and June. They sat on the cold floor and read aloud lines the girls had scrawled years before. The air in the crypt felt like a held breath finally released. Then, in a rusted tin box beneath the hymn sheet, Clara found an audio tape, an old cassette labeled in a single line of a teenage hand. For when we get old. They threaded the tape into a borrowed player, and the girls' voices spilled into the stone. Tentative harmonies, giggles in the margins, a cough, then a single voice saying, "If you find this." We were afraid of the library men. We hid the diary. We ran to the vestry. They took us to the van, but we sang so we would know each other. The tape cut out, then a rustle, then silence. The evidence was enough to begin an arrest. Trustees named, documents showing payments, and Kershaw's account of the Creighton admission that someone had moved the girls and hidden the evidence. But the prosecution had a harder burden, proving who had ordered the removal and whether the girls had been killed or taken elsewhere. The funeral of truth is slow and public, and the accused used time like a shield. Lawyers delayed, witnesses recanted or and the city's appetite for scandal wavered. Yet something else came to light in court. An elderly former cleaner, who'd been paid modestly by the Cathedral and left town years ago, testified she had seen the van and had been threatened to keep quiet. Her trembling testimony, paired with the ledger's shadow and the tape, was enough to send at least 2 men to trial for their roles in obstruction and concealment. The emotional collapse arrived in that packed courtroom as families watched the men, who'd decorated their town with stained glass windows, give careful, rehearsed answers. Some were convicted, others were not. The law, clumsy as it is, scratched at the surface of what had been done. After the court's slow grind, the city felt the odd stillness of weather after hail. Some trustees paid fines. Others retreated like tides scarred by exposure. The cathedral posted apologies, awkward and human. It stripped plaques, renamed rooms, and installed a memorial bench for the 7. The bench, simple stone, engraved with names, sat in the sunlight, where children sometimes left small flowers. Michael reopened his workshop to a small group of girls who came to learn the organ. He often paused, hand on a pew, and hummed fragments of a hymn nobody had heard in full for 33 years. June wrote a series of long pieces that cared for more than headline curiosity. She wrote about the girls' lives, the music they loved, the way they had eaten their sweets, the small acts of mischief they once committed. Her articles roped hearts back into memory and insisted the girls be people again, not just victims, not mere footnotes. Clara took long walks at dawn. She kept a folder in her desk labeled hymns, where she kept copies of the letters and the tape transcript. Sometimes she would play the cassette in her kitchen and listen to the laughter between verses. It was a strange comfort, like music learned as a child. She had prosecutions to complete, but she also had a private sense of closure. Not everything could be unearthed. Some corners would always hold shadows, but the city had returned a measure of truth. Not every question was answered. The fate of the girls in those first hours remained partially obscured by the men's lies and by time's erasure. Some documents were burned. Some memories had been bartered away. Families received settlements, not absolution. For those who had known the little habits to bead of a necklace that always snagged on a cardigan, the way one girl hummed a lullaby while writing marginal notes, the discovery was custody of memory more than the final line of a story. The parking lot outside the new hall looks ordinary today. People park, go to meetings, live lives. But beneath its foundation, the trunk slept for decades. Paper pressed flat against pavement, voices preserved in ink. The city had buried a secret and then let it seep back up through a crack. The bench for the 7 collected coins. On quiet evenings, a choir practice could be heard across the square. Sometimes, the organist would stumble and smile, and the room felt fuller for all that had been reclaimed. Sometimes, truth arrives like a small, stubborn, hymn-folded, faded, but still audible when someone presses an ear to the stone. Power can bury names and money can smooth conscience. But paper remembers, and voices remember, in ways that ledger entries cannot erase. The discovery of a trunk and a tape did not fix the years the families lost, but it gave them a language to grieve and a place to place their missing pieces. In the end, the smallest hands, the 7 girls who once doodled stars in him, margins left a map for those who would listen. That memory, like melody, keeps returning until it is finally heard.